They would rush at you, they would yell at you on the radio, they would threaten you, and they're testing your reaction in the sort of maritime cat and mouse. And you had to hold your nerve a bit. They would peel off at very close ranges, and I mean 20, 30 yards sometimes. You can get to a situation, and I've seen it in war games, where you run out of interceptors. And then what do you do? If the US just walk away from Hormuz, and Tehran is now allowed to impose a tariff on all ships forevermore, well, firstly, that's extremely beneficial to Iran's economy, so they can make a load of cash from that. Guess what they're going to do with that? It's not going to be for the welfare of their people. I think we can probably be sure of that. Good morning. My name's Tom Sharpe. I'm a retired Navy commander. I did 25 years in the Navy, of which I spent about 18 or 19 at sea, including operating in the Strait of Hormuz.
We are hearing reports today of a potential one-page memo deal, peace deal between the US and Iran. From a naval commander's perspective, does a piece of paper actually change the reality of a narrow-mined waterway, or is this just political theatre?
It's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, even with Project Freedom seemingly collapsing, whatever it was, by the way, but collapsing 24 hours after it was announced with great fanfare. And in that 24 hours, what we saw was some hurried kind of operational changes from places like Bahrain, trying to impose order on this new thing that no one knew was coming. And some of those orders were a little bit odd. Then we saw a flare up in action and counteraction, the risk of miscalculation forever going up. So it really didn't help anything. In fact, in some ways, it made it less stable, and pulling out those 2 US flagged merchant vessels didn't change anything either. So this latest one-side memo, this latest ceasefire, it's hard to know. It's clear that the markets are getting a little, are fatigued now with this sort of constant barrage of we're about to fix this, we've won this, we've won the war, and are reacting accordingly. So yeah, I don't know what this latest one-page memo does. I do know we still have 2 blockades imposed upon each other, one controlled by Iran, one controlled by the US. And those sides don't seem to want to move closer to a solution at the moment. So no, for now, nothing changes.
There are reportedly over 800 ships and 20,000 crew members stranded west of the Strait. Are these people effectively hostages at this point?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult for them. In fact, it's very difficult, and I'm glad you brought this up, because it quite often gets overlooked, as mariners often do in these situations. They're the ones often being asked to take the risk, and in this case, the risk is one of kind of just getting that they're stuck. A lot of them, their contracts in theory have already ended, and they should have been off the ship weeks or months ago. The conditions can be variable. That very much depends on the type of ship and the owners and They have been getting stores and supplies. So I don't think anyone's starving. I don't think this is a humanitarian issue, but it's not good either. And the one thing shipping really thrives on is a degree of certainty. The whole system, the logistics chain from port to port, of which this is just one little part, it needs a degree of predictability and a predictability to work, to function. And that's what's being taken away. So yeah, it can't be much fun for them in there, and constantly getting a sort of whisper that it might be time to go. Is this it? Are we going now? No, right, everyone back. Uncertainty is a real killer when you're at sea, and they've been getting plenty of that in the last couple of months for sure.
Just zooming in, if we look at the map of the Strait of Hormuz, and there's possible sea mines there, can you explain what the status of that is? I mean, it's just making it so tight to navigate. Is that going to be an easy cleanup operation if there is a peace deal?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The chart. Don't be totally fooled by the chart. I mean, I know we say it's a narrow waterway, but it is still 21 nautical miles. That's 40 kilometers. That's quite wide if you want to get ships through it. That doesn't mean it doesn't have to be coordinated. But it's not a disaster. So what we have at the moment is essentially 3 different routes. We've got the Iranian route north of Larak Island. Now they imposed that some weeks into this latest war, and basically said that the conventional route, the traffic separation scheme, or TSS, as it's inevitably abbreviated to, the TSS is now mined. you must come through the Larrick Strait, as I'm calling it, to keep clear of the mines. In reality, that was a very smart power play. It brought the ships closer to them. It made it easier for them to impose their toll, and it induced the idea of mines. It created the threat. And that's one of the problems with mines. It doesn't really matter whether they've been used or not. The threat of them is enough to stop ships from going through. So that's the northern leg, if you like. Then there's the regular traffic separation scheme that's been in place since the early 70s. The inbound leg is the northern one, and the outbound leg is the southern one, both in Omani territorial waters, but it's an international strait, so it carries a different set of rules and regulations. And then there's the southern one, which goes around the tip of Oman, which, interestingly, I don't know, historically interestingly, used to be the route. But it is quite tight there. It's deep, actually, it's deeper than the main bit, but they needed more coordination. The ships got bigger and bigger. So they moved them up in the 70s into the one that we now recognize. So you've got all these options. The Iranian, the ones passing through the Iranian toll are using the northern one, past Larrick. The ones that are busting the Iranian sanctions and sneaking out under cover of darkness and with their transponders switched off are using the Omani, the southern route. So yeah, we've got to provide some order to that. You can't have both ships coming in and out on the southern one, because then they will get too close. So my view is, when it comes to mine hunting, and this is, I haven't seen anyone else really sort of commentating on this particularly, but the simplest thing to do at this point is keep the southern one, the Omani one, for outbound traffic. We know that's clear of mines because loads of ships have been through it, including those cruise liners and and the American warships. So keep that for outbound, and then just clear the southern part of what was the traffic separation scheme, and clear that of mines. Now, again, how long that takes entirely depends on whether there are mines or not, and if there are mines, what type and how many. But we do have some stuff now that can clear those sorts of influence mines quite quickly. So days or weeks rather than months that the old systems used to take. So that's a long and slightly complex answer, and it might need the chart alongside it to make it clear. But that is what the maritime planners will be thinking about now, because at the end of this, they've got to assure the ships that are stuck in the Gulf and the ones that want to get in from outside that these lanes are clear of mines, as well as having written down the Iranian threat to the point where it can no longer shoot.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In your experience going through the Strait of Hormuz, was there anything that struck you that was unique by it, or was there a sense of threat from the coast, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, there was an actual threat every time I went through. Every time a ship deployed from the noughties into the teens, there was a sense that Iran was about to buy a weapon system that would make them invulnerable to Israeli airstrikes on their nuclear facilities, and that therefore Israel was going to strike. This was like a repeat theme. So every time you went there, there was a threat. And then the IRGC Navy, the IRGCN, who now everyone knows about, but they were a regular part of our lives and would routinely rush you in swarms of ships, jet skis, all sorts of bits and pieces. They would rush at you, they would yell at you on the radio, they would threaten you, and they're testing your reaction in the sort of maritime cat and mouse. And you had to hold your nerve a bit, because they would peel off at very close ranges, and I mean 20, 30 yards sometimes. So you've almost got to assume that they're not coming to attack you, and hope that your intelligence agencies will let you know if this is the one. And because by the time they're at 20 or 30 yards, it's way too late. You need to be engaging them at miles. So you had to trust your intelligence agencies, but they would still behave in that manner. And then they would light you up with fire control radars, so their missile batteries would spin up and they'd spike you. It's called an electronic warfare spike, where they ping you with their fire control radar. It lights up in your ops room. And now you've got a threat bearing. Okay, well, what does that mean? Are they about to fire, or are they just testing the system, or are they testing you? So that was absolutely routine. And to be honest, in your months in the Gulf, it was not just in the Strait, all the way through and into the Gulf itself. This happened all the time. So you did the whole deployment at a higher internal state of readiness than you would do elsewhere in the world for just this reason. And going through the Strait, you would generally go through that at what we call action stations, which is the highest stated readiness, just in case, just to be ready. And it also helps set the mindset. Here we are, that's the threat, and we're going to be working in sight of that threat for the next 4 or 5 months. So it was a good way to kind of adjust the mindset.
Yeah, with that context of the threat, there's reports that during this pause of Operation Freedom that Trump enabled, the US and Israel are plotting another strike or series of strikes. Do you think that's the right thing to do, and what are the possible targets?
Look, in broad terms, there are 2 possible target sets, if you like. There's the Strait of Hormuz target set, let's just call it that, i.e. getting after the weapons that are down in the southern part of Iran that are continuing to threaten the freedom of navigation. So that's the mobile missile launchers, the drone launchers, the fast attack craft, mine layers, and so on. So that's one package where they go again and they just keep striking those. The problem with that is the question is, can you write that down to 0? Because that's what it takes. It would need them to be all gone for ships to start going, okay, it's safe to leave now. And the problem is, I think the answer to that is no. I don't think you can. They're so well hidden and they're so dispersed. I don't think you can write that down to 0. And that's why I don't think we've seen an escalation again this time, because that's the advice being given. Because if you go again and you spend billions of dollars worth of very expensive munitions, and it doesn't work again, then what? You've kind of run out of options. The other strike package is the let's call it the regime strike package, where you go after the infrastructure, you go after energy production, you go after bridges and power lines, all with a view to creating such pain internally that the regime gets overthrown. Now, you could see a situation where you put those 2 together, and there are increasing reports of internal unrest and sleeper cells coming, sort of fighting the IRGC. You could see a situation where escalation happens, where you go after all of those again to try and get to this situation where the regime is overthrown. But what happens if that doesn't work again? And Israel is going to be supporting that course of action. But what if it doesn't work again? And what if you've just spent millions or billions of dollars of weapons, and then if they start firing back, if Iran start firing back, you're now burning through your interceptors again, like we were in the first few weeks of this, and that starts getting extremely expensive and actually numerically quite worrying. You can get to a situation, and I've seen it in war games, where you run out of interceptors, and then what do you do? So all of these nuances will be being played out right now, and I think because none of them end in a satisfactory answer, it's why we are where we are, with a sort of constant promise of freedom and success, when the reality is saying different.
Yeah, one of the striking things is US power versus a agile, disruptive enemy in terms of the swarm boats and attacks. Is America going to adapt? How is it going to tackle this long term?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And let's not forget that Iran has had basically since 1988, when Operation Praying Mantis was when the US Navy and Army went after the Iranian Navy at the back end of the tanker wars and absolutely obliterated it, because all they had then was a regular Navy. And they swore from that day on they needed to do this differently, because they could never go toe to toe with the US military, and quite rightly. So they've spent the intervening years producing this very mobile, very dispersed, very disaggregated strike packages across all domains, air, surface, and subsurface. They got these little mini submarines, they got the mines, for just this reason. So, and what we've learned, or what we actually already knew, and I think what the people who had been in the plan of this knew, but was ignored this time, was that you just can't go after all of those threats. So the technology needs to improve to locate them and strike them for future conflicts. But like all these things, a bit like the Black Sea as well, you do have to make sure you extract the right lessons. America and China, let's say, over Taiwan, that is a very different type of conflict. Iran has home advantage. It's very close in. It lends itself to the way they've configured their forces. And so yes, there are lots of lessons to be learned, but it's important to learn the right ones. You see blanket statements like, well, this renders US warships completely obsolete. It absolutely doesn't. No, it's just there. It's very, very difficult. And they have generated extreme effect. It hasn't worked yet, but it's still effective. The carriers have still been effective. If this escalates again, the Lincoln and the Bush strike groups will be at the forefront of the counter effort. So yeah, look, the nature of warfare is changing to an extent, and it is gradually moving towards more dispersed and more autonomy. But we've got to move at the right rate, not just throw everything away and start again. That would be the wrong lesson to learn from this.
Yeah, you mentioned China there. Trump meets Xi Jinping in a few days. What do you see China doing? I mean, they need the oil the most.
They do to an extent. They have extraordinary reserves, more than anyone else in that region, because they've thought this through and planned for it. So they've got a lot of what's called oil on the water. They are burning through that, but they've got other routes, and there are still some ships getting out of the strait with oil bound for them. So it's not the sort of 60-day cliff edge that everyone predicted. There was a sense at the start of this, and from the 1st of March, you get to 60 days, and we fall off the edge of the world. It's not that, but China definitely have a key part to play here. And what is there? We know they've been involved in a lot of the command and control and decision making in Tehran, pretty much from the start. We know they've imported elements of technology and perhaps even weapon systems. So they definitely have a role. I've been looking at their warships that they have stationed out in Djibouti. They generally have a squadron of about 3 ships. Are they going to start heading towards the strait? They absolutely have a key role. And if Iran is to stop firing, let's start with the basic assumption that for the strait to fully open, for freedom of navigation to be restored to pre-war levels, it needs Iran to stop firing. Then that can only happen one of 3 ways. One is that they're made to. Well, we've already discussed how difficult that is. One is that they choose to because the negotiations are going and they think, actually, we're in a good spot here, we can stop firing. And that seems a long way away, given that the requirements of both sides are so different. But the third, and as ever, often the best, is the diplomatic one, where they're told to by China. And I wonder if China were involved in the initial ceasefire when that happened, whatever it was, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago now. I think China were probably involved there. So yeah, the US-China delegation meetup in 8 days or whenever it is will be very important.
You've said that if Trump declares the strait safe and leaves after rescuing the US ships, it sets a dangerous precedent for choke points over the world. Does this mean the era of freedom of navigation is officially dead? And let's just frame that in terms of Taiwan.
Yeah, it could do. Look, I mean, freedom of navigation is the system, is the glue that holds the global trade system together, and has done since the end of the Second World War. And it's written in various, it's written in UNCLOS, the United Nations Law Convention of the Law of the Sea, and so on. And a lot of these things aren't signed up to. Some of them aren't even written down. They're just sort of an understanding, which makes people these days in the rapidly emerging era of strongman imperialism, it makes people, well, they just write it off and say, well, it's irrelevant. But it's not irrelevant. It's a set of guardrails that's understood by everyone. Now, you might not adhere to it. And if you look at China's behavior in the South China Sea and the 9-dash line and their total dismissal of the Hague ruling that said you can't claim the entire South China Sea as your own, and they went, we don't recognize that ruling. Okay, fine, but at least it was a ruling. It was an understanding that they knew what they were pushing against. And this is my fear. If US just walk away from Hormuz and Tehran is now allowed to impose a tariff on all ships forevermore, that is firstly, that's extremely beneficial to Iran's economy. So they can make a load of cash from that. And guess what they're going to do with that? It's not going to be for the welfare of their people. I think we can probably be sure of that. So there's the sort of operational problem, but the global strategic problem is the precedent it sets, whether that's in Malacca, Taiwan, the High North, Panama, Gibraltar. I mean, any of these choke points, anyone can now go, well, we'll just do the same thing. I think it's quite far fetched, but it is a problem. It's a concern, and it's one that the U.S. Navy has freedom of navigation absolutely baked into its DNA, and thank goodness, because they're the only ones who can actually really enforce this. So if it's the US who sort of stop enforcing it and in fact walk away from it, that sets a very dangerous precedent. I don't know how that plays out, but to me it feels a lot more threatening and a lot more expensive.
We spoke earlier about the threat from Iran. How does one deal with the Iranians? And maybe you can draw from your experience previously. I mean, we approach things from a Western point of view. How do we negotiate with them?
Yeah, I mean, that's eluded so many presidents and governments in the last, since 1979. How do you deal with it? Their missions and their way of thinking is so dissimilar to ours. And we used to find this when we were wargaming it. So we would play the blue team, or the good guys, and they would be and you would have people playing the red team. And the red team, you had to get Iranian experts in to make sure that their counter moves to what we were doing were not just what we would do. You have to think very differently. And it centers around an awful lot of things like this sort of, the fear of death, their willingness to die in pursuit of this cause. So a lot of the swarm attacks that I described earlier would have been suicide attacks with people in a boat packed with explosives who don't care if they live or die. And that changes the calculus completely. They don't care what civilian casualties they cause when they're firing at things. They just don't care at all. And so again, that talking about having a set of rules, a very thin set of rules that you're trying to apply to a situation against an enemy who just couldn't care less. So all of these things need to be factored in at a political level, and then at a military level. It's a different operating sort of base. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different mindset, and you've got to be able to unpick that. And this is why I think the idea of changing that regime into something more benign is so attractive. Getting a government in there that thinks more like us is attractive to us. Of course it is. Is it attractive to the rest of the Gulf countries? Is it attractive to them? Is probably the more important question. But that's that's part of this discussion right now. And I think when people talk about regime change, they don't mean what happened in the first 2 days of the war. Although I think actually perhaps the leadership in the US thought that. That's not regime change. That's just killing the top of the regime. When they talk about regime change, it's the complete removal of it and replacement with another ideology. And what does that ideology look like? Is it better or is it worse? And how do you get there? Well, the one thing we've discovered this time, in fact, we didn't discover this time, we've known it for decades, is that you can't get there from 30,000 feet in the air with a missile campaign. It just doesn't work. And that's where we are today.
Looking ahead into the future, we've seen Ukraine are launching Flamingo missiles, and that they never had those 4 years ago. It's been an extraordinary development of their military industrial complex. Iran did strike Saudi Arabia, and as we all know, they have trillions of dollars of petrol money. Are we going to see those Gulf states, armed to the hilt with flashy navies, top of the range missiles, and is that going to be the long-term plan, do you think, and Europe and the US can move away from Iran?
Yeah, really, really good question. And I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the US basing, let's start there. US basing across the GCC, across the Middle East, is a really important, what next question, because that was always there to provide the US with that sort of far-reaching access basing and overflight, same as the bases in the UK, same as the bases across Europe. This is American projection and influence. That their current way of thinking, withdrawing from Germany and bringing it all back to the US, is illogical in that regard. It makes them it makes them, if you just look at the way they're striking in Iran today and look at the dependency of those strikes on allies, providing them with the basing to do so, to threaten that is just, it's just nonsensical. But back to the Gulf states, they allowed US access for a number of reasons: exchange of money, exchange of weapons, technology, trust, influence, and so on. But the deal was, you base your aircraft here, and then you protect us when this kicks off. And that hasn't worked particularly well. Look at the number of strikes in the early phases of this war. Iran were able to fire in such great numbers that they were able to defeat the various interceptor systems. And again, those of us that mapped this out previously knew that would happen. But I think it caught everyone by surprise. So there's definitely going to be a moment where the GCC countries go, right, what's in this for us now? Do we want this? And we know, look at Saudi and the way it looks at America and China, and in fact a lot of those countries do. It's not as simple as picking a side, but you can see an adjustment of that basing and world order business out there. As to whether or not they now beef up their militaries, well, if the threat's Iran, then what's the point? Because we've just proven that the world's most powerful military can't defeat it. So why try? Why build billion-dollar warships? For when it won't necessarily work against your primary adversary in the region. So I don't know. I don't know how they develop their weapons. The counter drone stuff, the ability to to defeat people trying to strike you, whether that's a drone swarm or whatever. I think we've got a lot to learn from Ukraine in that respect. Not just in the technology, but in the speed with which they develop that technology, because they're at war and all the bureaucracy and all the rules have gone out the window. They just turn these systems around at an unbelievable rate. And then they put them into the front line, and then they test it in combat conditions. And then they bring it back and they iterate it and they go again. And so as a Western alliance, we've got to get much, much more agile, much faster when it comes to developing and iteratively developing our technology. We're way behind.
Can you see something catastrophic happening in the Straits in terms of ships colliding, for example?
Yeah, the risk in the Strait remains. And the last 48 hours during the Freedom Parade kind of made that very obvious. So just ships colliding is definitely an opportunity. Is definitely an option here. If 800 ships all weigh anchor at the same time and make a bid for freedom, I mean, I use the word melee. Perhaps that doesn't take it seriously enough, but it will be a scrum, and so someone's got to coordinate and prioritize. They've got to tell ships to wait. They've got to provide, well cohered routes. We talked a lot about the routes earlier. Someone with authority, and there are plenty of options there, but someone's got to take control of it. Have to map out these routes, and then allow the sailing of these ships in an orderly fashion, or chaos will ensue and the risk of collision will go through the roof. In the meantime, the risk of miscalculation is definitely there. The question in the back of everyone's mind since the start of this is, what has Iran kept back for a rainy day? What have they got in their locker that could cause a real menace? Just, when people start relaxing and thinking, I think is this moving again now? And the US send in another warship and they get at it and they're lucky, then they hit the warship. And I've always thought, and as have other analysts, that a major casualty event in, let's say, a warship, heaven forbid, but let's say that's the end of the war. That's American support for this completely gone, and the US now withdraws immediately. And that's partly why we've seen so few warship movements in the Gulf. It just hasn't, the risk metric hasn't permitted it. So what have they got? Yeah, what have they still got buried in a mountain somewhere? They've got some really good anti-ship cruise missiles that we haven't really seen used yet. Now, is that because they've been struck? They've all been struck? Or is it because they're so well hidden that they're keeping them back for when someone gets complacent and sends a ship in there? I don't know the answer to that. I hope it's the former, but I fear it's the latter. So yeah, the risk of collision is definitely something that's going to have to be dealt with. That's a slower, sort of more maritime coordination function, which I think we can probably do without too much difficulty. The risk of miscalculation because Iran have kept something back, or a warship sees something incorrectly and shoots it down. Sort of almost the USS Vincennes style in the 80s, where they thought they were coming under attack from an Iranian F-14, and actually it was an Airbus, and they shot down an airliner full of passengers. I mean, that's a horrific. That's the worst case scenario. Between these two, there are options, and the more tense it gets, and the more we get, daft announcements coming from both sides, and both sides now trying to take action against their respective blockades, the more the likelihood of that misunderstanding and that miscalculation goes up. So yeah, we are definitely not out of this yet.